So the first thing that I try to do here is I try to remain genuinely open-minded. I have some wrong views. I just don't know what they are yet. And so, just like our team has internally sometimes decided to change the way that we think about something, we're, interested in what outsiders have to say. So I'll give you a quick example of that. Rachel and I recorded a podcast recently about this thing that happened in Mississippi, where this buffer zone happened. And it's not like it's just this pro-life group's fault or something, but it sort of seemed to us, from what we learned from an insider, that if a certain pro-life group had a different strategy, it at least would have been a lot more likely that the buffer zone could have been avoided. And so we felt like we had to talk about that. Well, that's a complicated thing because now you're critiquing a pro-life group in public, something that we don't want to do very much. And so Rachel and I have been talking for, I don't know, probably like about a year, kind of trying to figure out like where do we want to land on that? Because there was a time like in my early life report days, like before ERI, I was kind of on a crusade to, just talk about the bad pro-life strategies. Like, come on, let's just save some babies. And we need someone in the movement doing that. But then I probably did it too much. It became like one of my main things, and I don't want it to be my main thing. And then when we started ERI, I think I probably overcorrected to the other side, just really taking my role as a national pro-life leader really seriously and just kind of just avoided public conflict as much as I could. And I think now where we're landing is something like we're going to avoid critiquing pro-life groups as much as possible. But there's going to be cases where we really ought to critique something, and when possible, we want to just critique the argument. So like there are going to be times that I hear a pro-life person teaching a bad pro-life argument that we might want to tell, like here's a reason maybe not to use this argument, here's a better argument to use instead. But usually we're not going to need to name who the person is that's, making that argument. We can just say, here's an argument that we heard. And usually in our head, we're going to know where we heard it, but like we don't need to call the person out. We would only call out the group like if we really, really had to. This Mississippi thing was one of those rare cases where we really had to, because part of the thing, you can listen to the podcast, I'll link to it if you want to know the details, but like there was like a case, like an agreement that was made as part of this, and we had to talk about that. That was part of the story, and the name of the group is in like the name of the agreement. There wasn't really a way to avoid saying who the pro-life group was in that case. But I just kind of fell in that, probably very narrow, rare situation where we feel like it's important to, maybe critique a strategy or try to help the pro-life movement to avoid a potential mistake. And like also had to say who the group was. And then our goal even there was just to be as gracious and charitable as possible. Something I don't think I was very good at, frankly, on Life Report. I wouldn't even agree with everything I said on Life Report. Like I haven't listened to it since, but if you come at me with like quotes that I said on there, I might just say, yeah, I don't agree with that anymore. But I certainly could have been a lot more gracious. I was a kid and I was just, firing off, all cylinders and not being as careful and wise as hopefully I'm trying to be more of that now. So that's kind of an example. It's one, just being open-minded, and we got a few people who had raised some concerns about us doing that podcast, and we interacted with them and heard their arguments and considered them, and that's the kind of thing that's one thing that we ought to be doing on this. Another thing is trying to avoid confirmation bias. So I don't just consider what certain pro-life activists think is effective. I'm looking at other effective movements, like the same-sex marriage movement for ideas. I pay attention to what psychologists are learning about persuasion instead of just listening to what apologists say. Like I'm trying to look at pro-life strategies or tactics from every angle. How will a particular activity affect different kinds of pro-choice people, for example? How is it going to affect post-abortive people? How is it going to affect other pro-life or conservative or even religious efforts going on? Like all these different things ought to be considered. Maybe not equally, but at some level, we're just trying to, we're thinking about those things when we're evaluating a strategy, and then we might try something to just try to see if is this working well, and then just do our best, both at a principled level, like what would make sense psychologically of like what would make sense of what would work, given pro-choice culture, given feminist culture, and how they think very, very differently than conservatives, and then combined with our best attempt at anecdotally trying to figure out what we're seeing work in front of us. Related to that, I'm also trying to make sure that we keep in mind that there's only so much that we can learn from anecdotes. It's easy to psychologically get tricked into thinking that a certain method works better than it actually does based only on anecdotal evidence. We want to be careful about the way that we think about anecdotal evidence. And then we also want to avoid projecting the way that we think onto pro-choice people, because again, they just think very, very differently. We know that based on psychological research, people on the left tend to be wired differently than people on the right. So it's a really common mistake for people on either side trying to figure out how do I change minds of people on the opposite side to kind of project their own, ideas of what it looks like to be in the other person's shoes onto them based on what they would react to, forgetting that the other side probably thinks really different than you and is motivated by different things than you. And so sometimes then we make mistakes and just end up not being very effective and this is a very easy psychological mistake, the idea of projecting your own, the way that you think or process information onto other people, especially people who are different from you. So we're just trying to avoid making that mistake.